Muy buenos días.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Members of delegations. The 28th plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination is called to order. The conference will now consider sub-item B of Agenda Item 7, entitled Report of the Credentials Committee. Delegations have before them the report of the Credentials Committee. It is issued as document A/conf.229/217/7. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Lot Zonzi of Malawi. He is the chair of the Credentials Committee. I ask him to introduce the report of the Credentials Committee.
La delegación de Malawi.
Malawi has the floor.
Chairperson, Excellencies, may I begin by congratulating the chairperson for being the first person in the United Nations floor to pronounce my surname correctly. On behalf of the Credentials Committee, I have the honor to introduce the report of the committee concerning the credentials of the representatives of states to the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument and to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination, as contained in document A/conference.229/2017/7. Having considered the credentials of the representative at its meeting on 6 July 2017, the Credentials Committee adopted without a vote a draft resolution accepting the credentials. The committee also recommended to the plenary of the conference the adoption of the draft resolution concerning credentials of representatives to the conference, contained in paragraph 14 of the report of the committee. I would like to note that since the meeting of the Credentials Committee, formal credentials were received by the Secretary General of the conference regarding Haiti. I would like to further note that since the meeting of the Credentials Committee, information concerning their representatives was received by the Secretary General of the conference regarding the following countries: Eritrea, Grenada, Sierra Leone, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, and Timor-Leste. The conference is therefore requested to adopt the draft resolution approving the report of the Credentials Committee and accept the additional credentials submitted subsequently to the meeting of the Credentials Committee. Finally, I would like to express my gratitude to the members of the committee and to the Secretariat for facilitating our work. Thank you so much.
Doy las gracias al presidente.
I would like to thank the chair of the Credentials Committee. May I take it that the conference wishes to adopt the draft resolution entitled credentials of representatives to the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination, recommended by the Credentials Committee in paragraph 14 of its report, and accept the additional credentials mentioned by the chair of the Credentials Committee. I hear no objection. It is so decided.
La conferencia concluye así.
The conference has thus concluded its consideration of sub-item 7B and of agenda item 7 as a whole.
La conferencia ahora reanudará.
The conference will now resume its consideration of agenda item 9 to adopt the final text of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, delegates, we have met this morning bolstered by our determination to adopt a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We are thus dealing with the mandate that has been conferred upon us on the 23rd of December 2016 in Resolution 71/258. We are going to leave this room today with the satisfaction of having accomplished and carried out our duty. Bolstered by this desire of the whole world to build a world of peace free from nuclear weapons. We have talked about the suffering of victims and their families after nuclear weapons have been used and nuclear tests and the fact that people are striving to get these weapons. We are going to adopt a text that enjoys legitimacy because it has been debated by all of you. It is a text that is based on very broad agreement. Its core is the standard of prohibiting nuclear weapons. Just like all deliberative and democratic processes, we have been able to have discussions amongst us. We've exchanged our opinions and discussed our differing opinions. This proposal basically reflects the agreements that have been reached between these different positions. This text used this standard of prohibiting nuclear weapons as its guiding path. This is something that is historic for humanity. Taking into consideration the need for to have complementary, that there are these different documents governing non-proliferation, and these all need to be complementary. Committed to the mandate conferred by the General Assembly of the United Nations, in this spirit, the text leaves the doors opened to nuclear weapon states and to other states who control them to be parties to this agreement. And so this translates the political resolve of this conference by bringing together the necessary conditions in order to eliminate these nuclear weapons. Pursuant to the resolution that has our mandate in it, since the 16th of February, we have been working non-stop. We have been working extremely intensively, in particularly in May and in particularly over these past 3 weeks here in New York to achieve this final text. I would like to thank each and every one of you. All those people who've been working from their capitals. I'd like to thank you for your commitment. I'd like to thank you for the compromises that you've been ready to make so that we have been able to shoulder this responsibility. We are here today to adopt this text and to give life to a new treaty that is complementary to the overall general architecture. This is a text that seeks to bring together the world where there is the dream of each and every person to have a world free from nuclear weapons. We are seeing the dreams of those working unfailingly in civil society fulfilled today. We are working to ensure that the international community can launch an appeal to all nuclear weapon states, urging them to start disarmament. We are just a few moments away from saying to the survivors, to say to those people who've been impacted by nuclear weapons that after so many decades, we have managed to sow the first seeds of a world free from nuclear weapons. We are just a few moments away from saying to our children that, yes, it is possible to inherit a world free from nuclear weapons. A world free from nuclear weapons for future generations. With these words, ladies and gentlemen, the conference is now going to examine document A/conf 229/2017 L3/Rev1, containing the text of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As agreed upon during the negotiations of the conference. I now submit this to the conference for consideration. May I take it that the conference would like to adopt this treaty by consensus, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, A/Conference 229/2017 L3/Rev1.
La delegación de Países Bajos ha solicitado el uso.
The delegation of the Netherlands has asked for the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this moment. I'm afraid there's no consensus in the room, and the Netherlands cannot support the text that is in front of us of the draft treaty that is under consideration, and we want to make a formal objection to its adoption. My delegation requests a formal recorded vote, and I will request the floor later on after the vote for a statement. Thank you very much.
La delegación de Países Bajos
The Netherlands delegation has requested a recorded vote on the text of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. I would like to remind delegations that pursuant to 35(1) of the rules of the conference, the decision of the conference saw on all substantive matters should be adopted by 2/3 of those voting. A 2/3 majority of the states present and voting. The conference shall now begin the voting process. Those in favour of the draft treaty contained in document A/conf 229/2017/L3/Rev1, please signify.
The conference is now voting on the adoption of the text of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as contained in document A/conf 229/2017 L3 Revision 1. I'd like to remind delegations that the green button indicates in favor, the red button indicates against, and the yellow button indicates abstention. Will all delegations kindly confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. The machine is locked.
Permítanme con una gran emoción
It is with a great deal of emotion that I would like to confirm the results of the vote. The result of the vote is as follows: in favour 122, against 1, abstentions 1. The draft treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is adopted.
tenemos una importante lista de oradores.
We have a long list of speakers who would like to explain their position after the vote. First of all, I'd like to give the floor to the delegation of El Salvador, who will speak on behalf of CELAC. El Salvador has the floor. Madam President, thank you very much. It is an honor for me to speak on behalf of the members of CELAC. We would like to congratulate Ambassador White Gomez for the excellent chairmanship of this conference. We would also like to commend her team. It is an honor for our community to see you chair this very important conference. As members of the first nuclear weapon-free zone through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, the first zone of peace, we would like to reiterate our serious concern of the threat posed to humanity by the existence of nuclear weapons, their use and the threat of their use, as well as their impact on humanity. We would underscore that nuclear weapons must never be used ever again, irrespective of the circumstances. The elimination of nuclear weapons or the use of nuclear weapons is a crime against humanity, a violation of international law, including international humanitarian law and the United Nations Charter. This is why the only real guarantee against the use or the threat of use of nuclear weapons is the total prohibition of them in a clearly defined timeline and in a completely verifiable manner. Madam President, our community commends the significant result that it has been achieved and the success of this conference. There is no doubt for us that this is a historic point in time after years of waiting. Today has finally come. This is the first multilateral agreed instrument within the UN prohibiting nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. The treaty understands the urgent need to have a nuclear weapons-free world. This is something that serves national interest, collective security interest too. Therefore, the adoption of this treaty is a break from the status quo, strengthening the non-proliferation regime and promoting disarmament. There are other things it represents. Today, we are paving the way for building a peaceful and safer nuclear weapons-free world. Thank you very much, Madam.
Le agradezco a la delegación de El Salvador.
I would like to thank the delegation of El Salvador. I now give the floor to the delegation of Lebanon, representing the Arab group.
La delegación del Líbano.
Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
اسمحوا لي أن أتقدم باسم الدول.
Thank you, Madam President. On behalf of all the Arab countries, I would like to congratulate you on your success in heading up this conference in order to achieve an international treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It is a very difficult and complex matter. However, your experience and your diplomacy has contributed over recent months to achieve this positive result. We would also like to thank the members of the Office of the Presidency of the Conference and the Secretariat represented by disarmament. We would like to express our sincere thanks to members of civil society who have been very active and who have made praiseworthy efforts. This really does highlight the important role of these organizations in the area of nuclear disarmament. This is a historic moment in time, undoubtedly, and we have been awaiting this for a very long time. The international community has waited some 70 years to prohibit nuclear weapons, given the destruction and chaos that they have caused. We have seen this at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. In this context, Madam, and because of the belief of Arab countries in the importance of this treaty, Arab countries have been involved in this since its inception and right up to today. We have actively participated in all the discussions that have taken place and negotiations during the different phases of this treaty. There is no doubt, rather, that this new treaty should be considered as an important historic addition to the global nuclear disarmament instrument. The adoption of this treaty is a new phase in international efforts seeking total nuclear disarmament. Madam, Arab countries would like today to state that their support for the text of this treaty reflects the positive Arab approach towards a nuclear weapons-free world. This is a collective approach. We have always defended this in international fora over recent decades. Nuclear weapon states must participate in this process to prohibit nuclear weapons in order to ensure their total elimination. This is because these countries bear the primary responsibility for ensuring that humanity is not struck by endless disasters caused by the use of nuclear weapons. Arab states would also like to state that Israel, and which did not to participate in this historic process, is pursuing its intransigent policy on nuclear weapons. Israel seems to be objecting to having the world and the Middle East free from nuclear weapons. The Arab world is cooperating helpfully in terms of efforts and is putting international interests over and beyond personal national interest. Nonetheless, Israel is still intransigent, and it refuses to cooperate with all international initiatives to create a nuclear weapons-free world. This is undermining peace and stability. This stance of Israel clearly reflects who wants to protect international peace and who wants to avoid their international responsibilities and this runs counter to the principles of the UN Charter. In this context, the Arab countries are convinced that the adoption of this treaty today sheds light once again on the importance of creating a nuclear weapons-free zone and a zone free from all weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. The aim here is to be in line with those of the new treaty. We hope that the new treaty will push forward efforts made to bolster the creation of such zones and ensure that this, which we've been waiting for a long time, will be achieved. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la delegación del...
I thank the delegation of Lebanon for their statement. They were speaking on behalf of the Arab group. I now give the floor to South Africa.
Thank you, Madam President. Permit me to begin by paying tribute to you, and on behalf of my country and the people of South Africa, to thank you from the bottom of our heart for leading us to the point where we're at. We're grateful to the member states of the United Nations that they rose to history. It truly is an honor and a great privilege for South Africa to have participated in this process. It is extraordinary for us to bear witness to the making of history in this manner. We believe that the 7th of July will go down in history as an epoch-making day. A day when truly we, as the people of the United Nations, working hand in hand with civil society, which has been an integral part of these negotiations, took an extraordinary step to save humanity from the frightful specter of nuclear weapons. Truly, we, the people of the United Nations, through this treaty, remembering the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have definitely said never, never, ever again under any circumstances. For us as a country, it was a duty to vote yes for this treaty. As Bishop Tutu said, disarmament is not an option for governments to take up or ignore. It is a moral duty owed by them to their own citizens and to our humanity as a whole. We must not await another Hiroshima or Nagasaki before finally mastering the political will to banish these weapons from our global arsenals. I am certain wherever Bishop Tutu is, he is delighted with what we've accomplished and thoroughly approves of what we have done. Permit me, Madam President, to pay tribute to the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki who are present with us. With them present here, we could not have voted in any other way but to allow this treaty to go through. To have voted no would have been a slap in the face of the victims of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. South Africa took this process very seriously from the beginning. We are pleased that it was a process that was interactive. It was a process in which parties negotiated with each other in good faith, and at the end of the day, we were able to fashion content material of the treaty that is truly representative of the will of the people. We're grateful of the role that our continent played against an incredible amount of pressure put on it not to participate in accordance with our beliefs in a world that is free of nuclear weapons. We conclude this treaty on the eve of Nelson Mandela Day, July the 8th. He was a firm believer in a world free of nuclear weapons. I cannot but believe that where he is, he's resting in peace, knowing that we've taken yet another step to make sure that we rid the world of the hazards and the dangers of nuclear weapons. We have only just finished but one piece of work. A major task lies ahead of us, which is ensuring that everybody comes into the fold of the treaty. The doors into this treaty have always been open, but some chose to abdicate leadership and not participate in the negotiations. However, in the manner in which we drafted the treaty, we were sensitive to their needs. We anticipated what they would require when they join. They have a moral duty to join. We have a moral duty to bring them in. Again, this is a very moving moment for us as South Africans. We believe fundamentally in disarmament. As you will recall, the denuclearization of South Africa was symbiotically linked to the democratization of South Africa. We drew back from the nuclear option as soon as Nelson Mandela was released, and we immediately joined the NPT. We believe fundamentally in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This treaty is an affirmation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in particular, Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It had to be done. As a country that was responsible for the indefinite extension of the NPT, we had to close this loophole. We had to close this loophole. We thank the member states from the bottom of our heart. We thank civil society from the bottom of our heart. And in conclusion, once more, Chair, we thank you most profoundly from the bottom of our heart. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of South Africa for their statement, and I thank them also for their kind words to the presidency. I now give the floor to Trinidad and Tobago on behalf of CARICOM. Thank you.
Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I'd like to make a very brief intervention. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. CARICOM congratulates you, Madam President, on your successful completion of this conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. We express our gratitude to you, your able team, and the Secretariat for your hard work and dedication. We are pleased that we have taken this historic step towards a world free of nuclear weapons. All delegations present have worked hard, and we should be proud of the statement we have made by being a part of this critical process. Future generations will refer to this treaty and the significant role it has played in advancing the multilateral nuclear disarmament agenda that has been stymied for such a significant period of time. We will also take this opportunity to acknowledge the role of civil society for their ongoing support in this endeavor, and we encourage further work in this regard. CARICOM stands with the international community to make a commitment towards a world free of nuclear weapons in the best interests of all humanity. CARICOM remains steadfast in its commitment to constructively work towards this goal and urge all member states to do the same as we forge ahead towards successful implementation. Thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida delegación.
I thank the delegation of Trinidad and Tobago on behalf of CARICOM, and I now give the floor to Cuba, followed by Chile. Cuba has the floor. Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons just took place, and it is an historic event. More than the result of this conference, this instrument is the fruit of multilateral discussions, a process that began more than 70 years ago. This began with the adoption by the General Assembly of the United Nations of its first resolution on the 24th of January, 1946. This resolution at that time was on the elimination of nuclear weapons, and this treaty is a tribute to all the victims of the use or the test of nuclear weapons. Moreover, this is a fundamental step forward on the path towards nuclear disarmament. This is a path that we must be committed to. The delegation of Cuba supports this treaty because it maintains the two primary goals that we had proposed. First, it establishes a new norm of international law to categorically prohibit nuclear weapons under any circumstances. And secondly, it creates a solid and legally binding basis for the destruction and total elimination of nuclear weapons in a transparent, irreversible, and verifiable manner with specific timetables in place. With this treaty, the international community has clearly stated that nuclear weapons are not only immoral, inhuman, but they're also undefendable. They are not justifiable. And now, moreover, they will be illegal. Madam President, we are pleased that more than prohibiting the development, production, transfer, possession, and stockpiling of nuclear weapons, this treaty has also explicitly prohibited the threat of their use. Security doctrines based on nuclear dissuasion thus are also considered illegal. We also are pleased to see that this new instrument goes beyond the limited scope of the Treaty on the Complete Prohibition of Nuclear Tests, which only prohibits nuclear tests through explosions. Here, all types of testing is prohibited. We feel it is crucial to stress that the transfer and financing of nuclear weapons is also prohibited under subitem E of Article 1. On Article 4, we wish to stress that states possessing nuclear weapons have been offered various ways forward to become party to the treaty, and we hope that this flexible approach, which is inclusive and non-discriminatory, that laid out in this instrument, will facilitate its universalization. Madam President, the threat of nuclear weapons is not an issue only for those states that possess them. This is something that is to be dealt with by the international community as a whole. No country is protected from the madness that would be a nuclear attack. There is the threat, nevertheless, that that could be caused by one of the 15,000 nuclear weapons existing on the world today. And this treaty is aiming to guarantee that no one will suffer from the terrible impact of these weapons in the future. The only way to do so is to prohibit and eliminate them completely. This is why nuclear weapons are and must continue to be their priority in disarmament affairs. As our Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro said during the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 12th of October, 1979, and I quote, "The time has come to no longer have illusions that the world's problems can be solved by nuclear weapons. Bombs can kill those who are hungry, those who are uneducated, and those who are detained, but we cannot use bombs to overcome hunger or disabilities or any other of these issues. Please allow me to thank you for all the efforts you have undertaken, Madam President, those of yours and your team for the work that we have undertaken. I also wish to thank the civil society for their work on these negotiations. Cuba will maintain its strong commitment to help generations to come to reach a better world, one that is forever free of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the delegation of Cuba, and I now give the floor to Chile, followed by Colombia, Costa Rica, and Venezuela. Chile. Thank you, Madam President. 71 years have gone past, Madam President. 71 years since Resolution Number 1 of the General Assembly, which already at that time called for the elimination of nuclear weapons. We have today lived a historic moment. Why? Because we have created the foundation for this historic time, not only the adoption of this treaty, but also because the process we undertook showed that democracy is possible. Democracy is possible in the international system. This democracy, Madam President, excludes all types of vetoes, and it is possible. As we have seen, our work is including civil society. Civil society, Madam President, they have showed the moral compass for these negotiations, and Chile wishes to honor them here. The partnerships that we have put into place with our colleagues from civil society, and truly they are our colleagues, these partnerships are crucial in the accomplishment of our mandate over this treaty. I also wish to speak to those countries who have supported the humanitarian aspect of this treaty. The political will seen and in being aware of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons. This led to a conviction that nuclear weapons are incompatible with international humanitarian law. This was seen first and foremost in the commitment made in Vienna and the promise, the humanitarian promise we saw in Vienna. It led us to this historic moment for international diplomacy. Madam President, our treaty was put to a vote. We wouldn't have wanted it to be put to a vote. However, Madam President, dear friends, dear colleagues, this vote did not undermine the legal importance of what we gain today. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was also put to a vote. This is a jus cogens norm that is part of the social fabric of our civilization. For the victims of the nuclear weapons, for the Hibakusha and the victims of nuclear testing who are with us today, as our colleague from South Africa said, the ambassador, she said, this is a time of moral justice for these victims. This is a moment that once again shows and reaffirms that humanity can do its best. Humanity is able to do its best. And finally, I wish to express my gratitude to you, to your team, Madam President, and to our colleagues from the Secretariat who have displayed their talents and have undertaken enormous efforts to allow us to have our documents on time and over the past few days. I also wish to state, Madam President, that this is a great honor and a great moment for Costa Rica and an honor for our region as a whole. Through two special declarations by the heads of state and government of CELAC, we have supported this process. And for all these reasons, Madam President, this is a time where you have led our work in a wonderful manner and work that is going to be accomplished for generations to come. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida delegación.
I thank the delegation of Chile for a statement. I now give the floor to Colombia. Madam President, Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, at the outset, allow me to congratulate you for your work in stewarding the negotiations on this legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. As we have already said, throughout this process, Colombia supports decisively these negotiations, those on the topic under discussion today, and we think that it is essential and urgent to free the world once and for all from the threat that is the mere existence of nuclear weapons. On behalf of my delegation, I wish to express my gratitude to you for your skillful guidance of this work, which have allowed this conference to conclude with success, namely the adoption of this draft treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. This treaty is one of significant advances for the disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation regime. This is why we voted for its adoption. Colombia is aware of the importance of this issue and has stressed the difficulty of the negotiations because there was only a short amount of time given for this negotiations, and this will this is something that we all participate in, namely the architecture of disarmament, and we must ensure that it gives justice to our ambitions. Moreover, we would have liked to have a text that was more clear, especially in Article 1A on the prohibition of the development, test, production, manufacture, and otherwise the stockpiling of nuclear weapons, and also in Article 4, Paragraph 2 on the total elimination of nuclear weapons. It was particularly focused on the possessors of nuclear weapons, and these implementations could be subject to various interpretations, which will predictably lead to some controversies. In conclusion, I wish to signal that Colombia hopes that the implementation of this treaty will contribute to peace, security, and stability at the national and regional level. Hopefully, it will promote better trust between states, and finally, will establish and maintain a world free of nuclear weapons. I thank you.
Agradezco a la distinguida delegación de Colombia.
I thank the delegation of Colombia for their statement. And I now give the floor to the delegation of Costa Rica.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, for a country like Costa Rica, whose foreign policy is based on the principle that it can defend principles with vigor without possessing weapons, that it is possible to create social well-being without becoming more wealthy, and that it was possible to raise the banner of sustainable development, human rights, and international development with strong positions and being having a committed but small diplomatic corps. We are especially proud of presiding this conference and having received a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, which will lead to their total elimination. Thank you, Madam President, for all the efforts you have undertaken. Thank you also for the efforts of everyone in the room. This treaty confirms that democracy is possible in nuclear disarmament. The countries that do not have nuclear weapons have the legitimacy necessary to achieve this legal framework. They also have a sufficient political influence to move processes forwards aimed those that are generally led by those who possess nuclear weapons. This has been seen in the Conference on Disarmament and in the General Assembly. The roots of this treaty are found in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all those areas where nuclear weapons have been tested, but also in Oslo, Nayarit, Vienna, and even here in New York. New York, a city that has heard and that has responded to the call for the initiative and humanitarian promise. The voices of states, parliaments, civil society, NGOs, think tanks, religious leaders, international movement of the Red Cross, universities. All these have called for years for specific measures to be taken and not just words. This so as to end this constant and costly arms race, which now has allowed for an active nuclear weapons to still be deployed, 15,000 of them. Some of them are currently under alert and could be susceptible to cyber attacks or could fall into the hands of malevolent forces. In disproportionate nature, multimillionaires are wasting this money on nuclear weapons, those that could be used to change the paradigm. That is what we are calling for. Those living in Costa Rica, they understand that human security and international development have priority over the theories of dissuasion and the use of force and the threat of the use of force, including nuclear weapons. There must be better assistance for development so that the SDGs can be achieved. These are only some of the examples of what could be possible. Madam President, this treaty is a triumph for multilateralism. This multilateralism has seen times of doubt. This is true.
Las consecuencias humanitarias y posteriormente eliminadas.
A path that the other weapons of mass destruction has, biological and chemical weapons, already began years ago. And we've done this because a considerable majority of the membership of this organization believes that nuclear weapons go against the survival instinct of our species. And the path towards negotiations, we have made concessions and we've listened to other states. We would have preferred that there were no provisions on the withdrawal, or that we would recognize the role of the International Court of Justice in the resolution of conflicts. However, we have made fundamental progress for the construction of a non-discriminatory regime which could, in the near future, be universal. The most important thing is that the document that we have adopted today is sound. It reflects the motivations and the concerns that underpin this treaty. It acknowledges the ethical imperatives for nuclear disarmament as a global public good, the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and the fact that these cannot be dealt with appropriately. The treaty also recognizes the needs of the victims, the catastrophic consequences for human survival and the environment, as well as the disproportionate impact that nuclear weapons have on women, on girls, and on indigenous populations. It refers to the risks of an accidental detonation or one by calculation or design, and above all, it establishes express prohibitions so that never and in no circumstance will they be produced, tried, transferred, or in any way used. Costa Rica would like to point out in particular the incorporation of positive obligations for assistance to victims as well as environmental restoration. This new international instrument meets the imperative of the prohibition and also contains a roadmap for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Madam Chair, it's time to work so that this treaty will enter into force for a world where the only powerful weapon that states will have would be international law. It's time to give an opportunity and a chance to peace through multilateralism. Once again, Madam President, thank you very much for all of your effort.
Le agradezco a la distinguida
I thank the distinguished delegation of Costa Rica. And I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Venezuela.
Gracias, querida Presidenta. Venezuela.
Thank you, Madam President. Venezuela supports the statement made by El Salvador on behalf of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, the CELAC. Madam President, first of all, allow me to congratulate you, Ambassador Ellen White, representative of our region, and let me thank you for the excellent work you have been doing in conducting the negotiations and all of the consultations and the multilateralism that made possible the adoption of this treaty, the first legally binding treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The holding of this conference was an extraordinary opportunity for diplomacy and disarmament, which shows the interest and the commitment of the majority of states that make up the membership of this meeting to achieve, in the end, the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Madam, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela supported enthusiastically and decisively the adoption of this treaty because we believe that it's imperative to move towards the objective of disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation, as well as to counter the threat that is represented by the existence of nuclear weapons and its use with disastrous consequences for humankind. We believe that such an important subject requires the collective effort of the community in order to adopt the urgent measures to guarantee that the world will never again see the terrible impact of nuclear weapons. We support and we underscore the importance of diplomatic and political efforts of all of the delegations who took part in this discussion in order to achieve this very important legal instrument, which has the virtue that after several years of stagnation in the diplomacy of nuclear disarmament, once again, finally, it clearly prohibits these weapons. We regret the lack in this discussion and in this collective effort, the absence of the nuclear weapon countries. We believe that these countries cannot continue to expose humankind to the danger of a nuclear conflagration, to the extinction of life. The use of nuclear weapons is a crime against humanity. No security doctrine and no national interest of any country, no military bloc could justify the mass killing of human beings, nor the destruction of the planet. The logic of life and peace should prevail instead of the culture of death and annihilation. Madam President, this treaty is an expression of the political will of the member states, the states parties, and we call upon all to apply it in the most appropriate way, to apply the prohibitions established in the treaty. It will also depend on the intention of nuclear weapon countries and those who benefit from its supposed security. It will be up to them to join this multilateral initiative as well. We would have wanted the document to reflect the transit of nuclear weapons between countries, and we hope that it will be understood that this restriction and this prohibition has to do with the entire process of possession and transit of nuclear weapons. The objective to eliminate nuclear weapons is a political and moral imperative that would commit all of the member states of this organization, in particular the countries that possess these weapons. The overwhelming support of the international community for this treaty, the result of the work of this conference, is undoubtedly a tribute, a posthumous tribute to the hundreds, the millions of lives which were sacrificed 70 years ago. We would like to pay a tribute to the victims of that catastrophe and acknowledge the tireless efforts of the survivors, as well as the rest of civil society present in this room in the building, adoption, and drafting of this treaty. And lastly, our country would like to reaffirm that the use or the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is a violation of the UN Charter, as well as a crime against humanity. And it's also a violation to international law, international humanitarian law, and the most minimal sense of humanity. Our country, as a state party to the nuclear weapon-free zone in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which is 50 years old, we share a deep concern for the threat posed by the existence of nuclear weapons to humankind, as well as the consequences of any detonation of these nuclear weapons. Madam President, we harbor the hope that this treaty will swiftly enter into force and it will be universalized, especially the support of countries that possess nuclear weapons who continue to threaten life on our planet. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the delegation of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Madam President. After the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, humanity has lived under the horror of the nuclear weapons. Since then, achieving a world free from such inhuman weapons has become a lofty goal for the international community of states. Along with many other nations, and as a victim of weapons of mass destruction, living in a region where Israeli nuclear program threatened the peoples of the Middle East, the Islamic Republic of Iran has always been and will remain one of the main advocates and staunch supporters of a nuclear weapon-free world. We consistently supported the realization of the objective of the total elimination of nuclear weapons, as in our view, it is the only absolute and viable guarantee against the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Iran's 1974 initiative for the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East and the issuance of a religious decree by His Eminence, the Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, to prohibit weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, clearly confirms the consistency of its position in this regard. Our first priority on nuclear disarmament, it means the conclusion of a comprehensive convention on nuclear weapons, is also very well known. However, we did not consider it to be in contradiction with a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Rather, we believed that the prohibition treaty could create a momentum for its realization. Based on this principled position, and in spirit, my delegation supported the UN General Assembly resolution calling for convening this conference. In the first session of the conference, my delegation stressed that the Prohibition Treaty should complement and strengthen existing relevant international legally binding instruments through filling their gaps and avoiding reproduction of their contents. During this session, we contributed actively, constructively, and responsibly to the drafting of the treaty and made every effort aimed at its improvement. We are now pleased to see that some of our proposals are reflected in the treaty, particularly on the prohibition of the threatening to use nuclear weapons, contribution of the religious leaders to nuclear disarmament, and elimination or irreversible conversion of all nuclear weapons-related facilities. We are also satisfied with the addition of some important concepts and new substantive elements to the treaty, which resulted in its further improvement. Overall, while the treaty has many positive points, it also lacks several elements that was expected to encompass in order to consider as a sound and robust legally binding instrument that is also void of any ambiguity and confusion. The treaty explicitly declares in its preamble that the total elimination of nuclear weapons is the only way to guarantee that nuclear weapons are never used again under any circumstances. It then reaffirms the legal obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. Thereafter, it reaffirms the ethical imperatives for the nuclear disarmament. Furthermore, it appropriately addresses the urgency of achieving and maintaining a nuclear weapon-free world, which rightly qualifies it as a global public good of highest order. These are all enjoyed our full support. Preamble of the treaty also comprehensively addresses almost all catastrophic humanitarian aspects of the use or detonation of a nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, it could have been strengthened by addressing other major concepts, such as declaring any use of nuclear weapons is a crime against humanity, as this concept has been recognized and reaffirmed by the UN General Assembly for decades and is directly related to the subject matter of the treaty. Madam President, we do value the inclusion of the threatened to use in Article 1 of the treaty as an unambiguous undertaking. It is not clear that it is an explicit obligation, never under any circumstances, to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. It indeed could not be better than that. Nevertheless, in our view, a paragraph in the preamble declaring the prohibition of threatening to use nuclear weapons under international law could be added to the treaty. In preamble, such important issues as the production, maintenance, and modernization of nuclear weapons are referred only for the standpoint of the waste of economic and human resources that, of course, is a bitter reality. However, it should not divert attention from a larger essential fact. It means nuclear arms race, which is the direct result of such activities. Such a shortcoming is unfortunate, particularly at a time when all nuclear weapon possessors continue to modernize or upgrade their nuclear weapons arsenal, and certain nuclear weapon states have plans to develop new types of such weapons. This situation, along with the statement of a certain nuclear weapon state announcing its intention to continuously strengthen and expand its nuclear arsenal to make sure that it is at the top of the pack, that indeed is an explicit call for the start of a new nuclear arms race, proves the high importance of this issue. Despite overall improvement of Article 1, in our view, and that many of other delegations, it still suffers from the lack of incorporation of the explicit prohibition of transit of nuclear weapons, despite enjoying wide support. However, in our view, even in the absence of such an explicit reference, any transit of nuclear weapons would clearly defeat the object and purpose of the treaty. It is also the case for the absence of an explicit prohibition of all types of nuclear weapon testing, which we supported. The current general reference to test prohibition might be abused to maintain the status quo by allowing the most technologically sophisticated nuclear weapon states to continue with the vertical proliferation of nuclear arsenals through subcritical tests, computer simulation, and alike. We would have wished to see such a definite obligation in the treaty in order to fill the similar gap that exists in the other treaty, and ultimately to constrain the possibility of developing new and even more dangerous nuclear weapons. On Article 2 to 4, our understanding is that a flexible approach has been adopted for drafting them in order to encourage nuclear weapon possessors to join the treaty. We hope these good intentions will be reciprocated positively. Based on our principled position in supporting all international activities aimed at nuclear disarmament, as well as our overall assessment of the text, we decided to vote in favor of this treaty, as despite some shortcomings, the overall objective of the treaty, it means the prohibition of nuclear weapons, can enjoy our strong support. The text of the treaty shall later on be truly examined by our competent national authorities. Therefore, pending any decision on signing the treaty, I would like to put on record that all our legal obligations and political positions on this issue related to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation will remain unchanged and would not be and shall not be considered affected because of our participation in the conference. In conclusion, by congratulating you, Madam President, and all participants for adoption of the treaty, I must reiterate the continued support of the Islamic Republic of Iran for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. We will continue to cooperate with all nations in this regard. This is a collective responsibility, and we stand ready to fulfill it faithfully. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Iran, and I now give the floor to the delegation of the State of Palestine.
I am a proud son of the State of Palestine, ambassador at the United Nations and ambassador of the State of Palestine to your beautiful country, Costa Rica, concurrently, to have the privilege of voting in favor of adopting the treaty on behalf of the Palestinian people and leadership. Madam President, the State of Palestine associates itself with the statement delivered by Lebanon on behalf of the Arab group. Allow me at the outset to commend you for your stewardship of this process, which together with the will and determination of the membership of the conference led to this successful historic outcome. We also commend the active participation and valuable contribution of civil society organizations to the success of this conference and to the elaboration of this treaty. We had said at the opening of the conference that the human race is the first species to ever develop the instruments of its own extinction, while insisting that doomsday is not inevitable and that the power of collective will should never be underestimated. This treaty is an expression of the power of collective will. There is no substitute to the total elimination of nuclear weapons to preserve us from the existential threat posed by their potential use. This is an essential contribution to international peace and security. Over 70 years after the establishment of the United Nations, which had the issue of nuclear disarmament on its agenda since inception, we can all be proud of having finally elaborated a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination. All weapons of mass destruction must be prohibited, as their use is incompatible in all times and under all circumstances with the rules of international law, notably international humanitarian law. The exceptional status granted until now to nuclear weapons cannot be justified, nor can the NPT be interpreted as allowing indefinite possession of nuclear weapons. The establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones constitute an important contribution to nuclear disarmament, and as such, the establishment of a zone free of nuclear weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction in the region of the Middle East deserves the support of all and is more urgent than ever. Such a zone should be open to all and stoppable by none. Finally, Madam President, let me seize this opportunity to reiterate the State of Palestine's appreciation for the decision adopted by the conference by consensus to allow for its participation in this conference with equal rights, including the right to vote, and I am so proud that I participated in this process of voting, a right it proudly used today to support the adoption of this treaty. Palestine was, throughout this process, to the best of its abilities, an active, constructive, and integral partner in this endeavor, which constitutes a truly historical step towards a world free of nuclear weapons, and over 70 years after the nuclear weapons were first used, this moral imperative has finally found a normative expression in this prohibition treaty, fulfilling the objective of ridding the world of nuclear weapons remains our collective duty towards the hibakusha, all victims, and all humanity. And I thank you very much, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished delegation of the State of Palestine. I now give the floor to the delegation of Brazil, followed by Ecuador.
Thank you, Madam President. The adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a milestone for the legal disarmament regime and for the international peace and security. Ever since the first nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, the world has lived in fear of the most lethal and disproportionate weapon created by man. For more than 70 years, the international community has been striving to achieve the goal of a nuclear weapon-free world. Driven by its grave concern over the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of these weapons and by the conviction of the shared responsibility to ensure that they are never used again, this conference gathered over the past 3 weeks to negotiate a clear and unequivocal norm to prohibit them, leading to their total elimination. Brazil was one of the proponents of the General Assembly resolution that convened this process because we were convinced it was high time to take a fundamental step to advance nuclear disarmament by filling a disconcerting gap and strengthening the current legal regime. Our active engagement in the process, which culminated in this treaty, is a natural reflection of our long-standing commitment to nuclear disarmament enshrined in our Constitution, which forbids the conduct of any non-peaceful nuclear activity in our territory. Brazil is a party to all major treaties in the field of disarmament and non-proliferation, including the NPT and the CTBT and the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which turned Latin America and the Caribbean into the first nuclear weapon-free zone in a densely populated region. The adoption of this treaty is also a victory for multilateralism, and in particular, multilateral nuclear disarmament, the only effective way to deal with the global threat presented by the continued existence of nuclear weapons. Prohibition comes often before elimination, as illustrated by the chemical weapons process. We must not underestimate the steady incremental influence of norms on international politics. They reflect values held dear by the international community, creating a strong disincentive to deviate from the established pattern. Historic as this occasion may be, we must not lose sight of the work that still remains to be done to achieve our ultimate goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. In addition to a swift entry into force of this treaty, we will need continued dialogue with those who did not join this process, including those who possess nuclear weapons, so as to eventually achieve the universalization of our treaty. One of the strengths of this conference was its inclusive nature, its openness to not only all states and international organizations, but also civil society, allowed us to benefit from their important contributions and resulted in a stronger treaty. Civil society in particular played a fundamental role in bringing us here today through the renewed attention that they drew to the unacceptable destruction and suffering caused by nuclear weapons, highlighted in the conference held in Oslo, Nayarit, and Vienna. Last but not least, I would like to congratulate you, Madam President, for your leadership and for your excellent work throughout these negotiations. You successfully fulfilled the challenging mandate and conducted this conference in an open, transparent, and inclusive manner, preserving the credibility of this process. We also extend our gratitude to the Secretariat. Today, we are one significant step closer to the nuclear weapon-free world. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Brazil, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Ecuador, followed by Paraguay.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, today, the 7th of July, 2017, will go down in the annals of history as one of the most important moments in the quest for peace. A conference of states convened by the General Assembly of the United Nations adopts a treaty which prohibits nuclear weapons. These weapons, whose devastating consequences for humankind we are all aware of, these weapons are now prohibited by an international legally binding instrument with a universal vocation, which will be open for the signature of all states. We are grateful to those who have been at the helm of this conference for having, and in particular you, Madam President, we thank you for having conducted us to this long-awaited result, as well as to the facilitators who displayed expertise, wisdom, and transparency in exercising the functions entrusted to them. We would also totally identify with the statement made by the representative of El Salvador on behalf of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, which we are honored to be a part of. Ecuador would like to also especially acknowledge the tireless efforts of civil society. And I'm not mistaken when I say that we would not be here if it weren't for their tenacity and commitment. We have waited for more than 70 years to close this stage of history, which began with the first nuclear detonation on the 16th of July, 1945. And now the most important thing is to begin another era where, backed by the awareness of all of humankind, in the action of peace-loving states along with civil society, we will have to convince one by one every state that now believes that their security depends directly or indirectly on nuclear weapons, which can and which must join this treaty and assume the obligations contained in the treaty. In doing so, they will be making a concrete contribution to the security of their citizens and, above all, to the collective security of all of the inhabitants of our planet. Now, from this morning on, Madam President, this treaty is a part of international law. For Ecuador, the treaty generally meets the objectives that we were seeking when we began this process. On a humanitarian basis, prohibiting clearly and undeniably all activities related to nuclear weapons. For my delegation, among other achievements, it's important that we have acknowledged the catastrophic consequences of these weapons, including their disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable populations. Especially relevant is the prohibition of the threat of the use of nuclear weapons, thus delegitimizing any veneer of legality to nuclear deterrence doctrines, all based on risking the very survival of humankind. The treaty considers the necessary flexibility so that states who currently possess or harbor nuclear weapons can join the treaty and thus specifically confirm their vocation for peace and their commitment to concrete and effective nuclear disarmament. It's normal that in the negotiating process for any treaty, it's not always possible to include everything that the participants would like to see reflected in the text. The Ecuadorian delegation would have preferred that in Article 1 of the treaty, we make explicit mention of the prohibitions of transit of nuclear weapons, their financing, and also organizing military preparations for their use. For that reason, I would like to declare on behalf of Ecuador the following. The clauses in Article 1 which prohibit assisting, encouraging, or leading to the holding of activities prohibited in this article, along with the prohibition of placement, installation, or deployment of nuclear weapons, implicitly includes, among other elements, the prohibition of a transit of vessels and aircraft that carry nuclear weapons in the areas under the jurisdiction of a state party, notwithstanding the relevant provisions of international law and international aeronautical law. These provisions implicitly prohibit as well the docking of vessels and the landing of aircraft which carry nuclear weapons in ports and airports in a state party to the treaty. That the above-mentioned we'd also like to express our opinion that the above-mentioned clauses implicitly prohibit as well the participation of a state party in military preparations for the use of nuclear weapons. Paragraph E of Article 1, along with the obligation of national implementation of the provisions of the treaty under Article 5, implies, the need for member states to prohibit their citizens from financing activities prohibited by the treaty. And lastly, we believe that the verb to test of paragraph A of Article 1 includes nuclear, explosive, and non-explosive tests. Madam President, for the delegation of Ecuador, it's been a source of particular pride to have taken part in the joint effort which has led to this conference and for having participated actively in it. At the opening of the conference in March of this year, I recalled the historical commitment of Ecuador to nuclear disarmament from the very inception of the United Nations. Today, this commitment is reaffirmed categorically. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida delegación.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Ecuador.
Le doy la palabra a la delegación de Paraguay.
I give the floor to the delegation of Paraguay. Madam President, I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the delegation of the Republic of Paraguay. I would like to begin by thanking you for your work, Madam President, at the helm of this conference. And through you, I would like to thank all of those who have contributed to its successful conclusion. I acknowledge as well the dedication and the commitment displayed by the delegations of the member states to reach an agreement on the text of the treaty during the negotiations. In Paraguay, the prohibition of weapons of mass destruction is considered in a constitutional standard, and thus we welcome the adoption of the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons today, reaffirming our conviction that the nuclear disarmament process must be transparent and irreversible, should call for effective verification mechanisms, and should be based on a universal framework which is also legally binding in nature. I reiterate, Madam President, that to conclude, I reiterate the congratulations of the Republic of Paraguay to all of the other nations, peace-loving nations, who respect the principles of international law, of international humanitarian law, and of human rights for the achievement of this historic milestone. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida delegación del
I thank the distinguished delegation of Paraguay.
Le doy la palabra a la
I now give the floor to the delegation of Malaysia, followed by Peru.
Thank you, Madam President. Given the long list of speakers, I'll be very, very brief. Malaysia is pleased to vote in favor of this treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. This is a historic juncture in nuclear disarmament. We were all guided by the goal of having an instrument which is legally sound, feasible to implement, and sends the powerful political message that nuclear weapons are unacceptable and categorically rejected. This treaty fulfills these criteria. This instrument strengthens the global norms against nuclear weapons. It stigmatizes such weapons and not countries. It is inclusive, with pathways open for other states to become party in the future, including those possessing nuclear weapons and those that have defense arrangements with them. We hope that the political and legal impact of this treaty on nuclear disarmament discourse will provide the much-needed direction for further initiatives aimed at the elimination of nuclear weapons and the maintenance of a world free of nuclear weapons. Much time, energy, and efforts have been put into this process, resulting in the adoption of the treaty. We are where we are now because of the contributions of so many. In this regard, we congratulate and thank you, Madam President, for your excellent leadership in shepherding this challenging process. We also thank your team for their hard work, the Secretariat for their tireless support, and all delegations for their constructive participation, which have enabled us to adopt this treaty today. We also thank the civil societies for their persistent, steadfast, and unwavering support to achieving our shared goal. We have achieved the objectives and mandate of this conference, but we must not rest on our laurels. We must now collectively direct our energies towards the entry into force of this instrument. You can count on Malaysia in this endeavor. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la
I thank the distinguished delegation of Malaysia. And may I remind all delegations that we are still in the segment where we are explaining our votes after the vote. And there is a place in the program for general statements, you're reminded. Having made that clarification, what I will now do is give the floor to the delegation of Peru, and they will be followed by Argentina. Thank you, Madam President. Allow me, through you, to congratulate the conference and members of the Secretariat, and especially you and your team for having carried out this negotiating process and having done so in a very correct, constructive, and transparent way. Today is an extremely historic moment for the international community and indeed all states who are resolutely committed to peace, security, and disarmament. But it is all the more historic because of the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all the survivors of nuclear blasts. Today, this binding instrument is the beginning of a process towards eliminating nuclear weapons. We are cognizant and we recognize the serious threat represented by nuclear weapons for humanity and the urgent need to prohibit and totally eliminate them. And it is for this reason that my country has voted in favor. Peru is one of the states promoting the establishment in Latin America and Caribbean of the first nuclear weapon-free zone in the world under the Tlatelolco Treaty. We welcome this treaty because it is an essential milestone and it reflects our efforts to prohibit nuclear weapons because of their inhumane and indiscriminate effects. It has taken decades of activism, years of discussions and strategies and complex negotiating meetings. And today this is culminating in a break with the status quo and the doing away with WMDs. This treaty prohibits the policies and practices underpinning nuclear weapons, including those related to nuclear deterrence. Though they are not explicitly prohibited in the provisions, they are implicitly prohibited in the spirit of this, it prohibits develop, use, and all other related aspects of nuclear weapons. Madam President, for my delegation, it would have been critically important to have the text of the treaty capture all the concerns referring to nuclear weapons and then an explicit reference to transit through the areas under jurisdiction under states. However, we understand that in a process such as this, it is impossible to cover all the concerns of all states, and therefore my delegation wishes to point out that it is our understanding that the provision on transit of nuclear explosives would be covered in the provision of assistance in the 1E. Madam President, my country wishes to reiterate that this treaty does not grant international provisions that would transcend those of collective security. Finally, we wish to renew our thanks to the various stakeholders of civil society. Without their support and determination, it would have been more difficult to get to this stage. Thank you very much.
Agradezco a la distinguida delegación.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Peru. And I'll give the floor to the delegation of Argentina, followed by Indonesia.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The delegation of Argentina joins others in thanking, endorses the thanks expressed by El Salvador on behalf of CELAC to you and your team. We support the adoption of this text because this treaty comes out clearly in favor of the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and this is the traditional position of our country on disarmament. It is our understanding that this includes, we regret that it did not include prohibitions on transit. We highlight the scope of the text into IHL and the catastrophic humanitarian consequence of the use of nuclear weapons. We welcome the fact that it recognizes the NPT as the cornerstone of the disarmament and non-proliferation regimes, as was mandated in paragraph 6 of Resolution 72-258. And this was complementary, and it will strengthen the 3 non-proliferation pillars. We would have liked to see this referred to CTBT, which establishes nuclear weapon-free zones. Our understanding is that the process that is beginning will be on the basis of achievements that were achieved over the last 50 years. And it is clear that the commitments that have already been taken on by states are still valid, and nothing in this treaty throws them into doubt or opens up any reinterpretation. My delegation was very involved in the negotiation of Article 3, and this text will strengthen one of the NPT pillars based on the objectives that we were set by the General Assembly. We would regret that there is an attempt to interpret this article to give the possibility of bringing in an array of legal sources that would jeopardize the safeguard regime in the NPT. The NPT system in general reflects the nuclear weapon states, and it can weaken this. However, this instrument is an ambitious undertaking, and for Argentina, this mechanism should not duplicate the competences of established fora. We understand that the verification mechanism in Article 4 should be based on existing international institutions such as the IAEA. Let us remember that before us we have a challenge of codifying the express prohibition of nuclear weapons with a view to totally eliminating them and moving towards the implementation of Article 6 of the NPT. And this text is a step in this direction. We regret the absence in this text of negotiation of by the nuclear weapons states. We would have wanted to place on record our difficulties with the text and to guarantee the principle of transparency and inclusiveness that must prevail in multilateral negotiations. And this is traditionally characteristic of most of the countries here in this room. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Le agradezco la...
I thank the distinguished delegation of Argentina. I now give the floor to the delegation of Indonesia, followed by Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by expressing our appreciation for your hard work and able stewardship in our deliberation, and I'm personally pleased to have been working with you as one of the vice presidents of the conference. During our 2 rounds of negotiation for a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards total eliminations, delegation, including Indonesia, have expressed positions and put forward proposed amendments to the text. We have gone through a very extensive negotiations, and finally, we succeeded in achieving the text as we have now. We share the view that the current text is not a perfect one. No treaty is indeed perfect and has not yet satisfied each and every delegation. So many provisions, in our view, should have been included in a view of having a stronger text to pursue our common objective, that is to prohibit totally nuclear weapons toward creating a nuclear weapons-free world. But having said that, Madam President, my delegation views that the current text is significantly crucial in our efforts toward nuclear disarmament. It is a big step forward. It is a historic landmark. It is a significant jumpstart for commencing a more concrete and energized endeavor to reach our common goal in getting rid of nuclear weapons from our planet. Therefore, Madam President, Indonesia is pleased to put in favor of the draft resolution, the draft treaty. Let me conclude, Madam President, by reiterating that as a strong proponent of nuclear disarmament, Indonesia stands ready to work closely with all delegations and civil society organizations in the full and effective implementations of the treaty and in bringing all nuclear weapon states on board. And I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the delegation of Kazakhstan, and they will be followed by the Holy See.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, first of all, our delegation would like to express its warm gratitude to you, Madam President, and your team for immense hard work and dedication. We also convey our sincerest appreciation to Tom Akram, Secretary General of Conference, and the UNODA for their invaluable support to the negotiations. And we thank the civil society which support us from the back rows behind us. Nevertheless, I'm also taking the floor to express my delegation's regrets at the recent developments and voting. Kazakhstan has a moral right and moral obligation to pursue nuclear disarmament, and we supported the adoption of the treaty. At the same time, we have repeatedly stressed that we need an instrument that is truly agreed on by all delegations by consensus. I would like to describe this process of our long but not yet completed path, quoting the words of famous Lebanese philosopher and artist Gibran Khalil Gibran, who said, "Move forward, never stop. Moving forward leads to perfectionism." In this context, we clearly see our common goal, the entire planet as one nuclear weapon-free zone, and our world to be free of nuclear weapons. And we are therefore ready to go forward tirelessly. I thank you for your attention.
Le agradezco la
I thank the distinguished delegation of Kazakhstan for that statement. I now give the floor to the delegation of the Holy See.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you. Madam President, on behalf of the delegation of the Holy See, I would like to express to Your Excellency our deep appreciation and gratitude for your leadership during these past 3 weeks. We thank you for the long days you and your staff have put in to find compromise, and we thank you for the inventiveness with which you have brought our deliberations to their ultimate goal. The Holy See is grateful to the conference for adopting this treaty. We are also grateful to those delegations who supported the proposals from its delegation, those made in successive draft texts and up until the final draft. The Holy See stands in admiration of the knowledge and the skill with which all, and particularly with which the facilitators, have contributed to the deliberations during the negotiations. Madam President, for more than 70 years, the Holy See has regarded nuclear disarmament as essential to establishing a stable and lasting peace. This is an element for common well-being. In his 2017 World Day of Peace message, Pope Francis once again made a plea for disarmament and for the prohibition and abolition of nuclear weapons. The Holy See will continue to fulfill its commitments to nuclear disarmament by organizing 2 conferences on the elimination of nuclear weapons. They will take place this autumn at the Vatican. Over the past 3 weeks, our gathering has represented the global majority, undertaking responsibility for a brighter future for humanity. This conference has also benefited from contributions by civil society. Their expertise and moral passion continue to inspire our efforts. Together, we have endeavored to achieve a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons leading to their elimination. This ban treaty is just a beginning. There is much left to be done to persuade those not in this room that this ban is in the interest of their peoples and of their states. Steps especially need to be taken to engage nuclear weapon possessing states to fulfill their obligations for disarmament under the NPT. As a party to the NPT, the Holy See recalls the importance of parties' commitments to general and complete disarmament as well as nuclear abolition. No weapon-possessing state will be persuaded to eliminate its weapons without assurances that it will not then be left facing a conventional imbalance of forces. Madam President, today we have struck one more blow on the anvil of history. We have thus fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. They beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and never again will they learn war. The Holy See is committed to continue to walk with you along the paths of peace. Thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco mucho la
I thank the distinguished delegation of the Holy See. I now give the floor to the delegation of Liechtenstein, and they'll be followed by Egypt.
Madam President, distinguished delegates, today is a historic day for the United Nations and the peoples around the world on whose behalf we have all committed to the UN Charter. We have come together after intense negotiations to adopt a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons in the firm hope that this will lead to their total elimination. It's been said by others, this brings us back to the very beginning of the United Nations. In its first resolution in 1946, with fresh memories of the horrors of the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the General Assembly issued a call to eliminate nuclear weapons. This call has been repeated innumerable times over many decades. Throughout all these years, it has been strongly promoted by those who have suffered the most from these weapons, the Hibakusha and the many victims of nuclear tests, as well as by civil society movements across the world. They own an enormous part in today's achievement. Today, we close a gap in international law. After prohibiting biological weapons and chemical weapons, we can finally say that nuclear weapons too, the most devastating weapons of all, are prohibited by a legally binding instrument open to all states. For Liechtenstein, it was an honor to participate in this joint undertaking. Madam President, our deep appreciation and our gratitude go to you, to your team, and to Costa Rica, with its proud tradition for peace and disarmament, for the tremendous efforts in guiding us to this final version of the treaty, behind which we can unite and take ownership. Under great constraints, you have succeeded in creating the conditions for our constructive deliberations while holding up the basic principles of multilateralism, inclusiveness, and transparency. These principles also find their reflection in our treaty. I would also like to thank the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs and her team for their political support, technical expertise, and enormous commitment to the process. Madam President, we have achieved a very good result that lives up to our high expectations at the beginning of this process. The treaty's core prohibitions are both clear and comprehensive and do not leave any doubt about the aim of our endeavor. The treaty also reflects our aspiration to create a universal norm. We have not shied away from addressing the inherent complexities of this goal, which is what we must ultimately strive for. While we are under no illusion that it will be a lengthy process, the treaty offers an open door for nuclear weapon states that want to change course and join those who wish to prohibit nuclear weapons as the best way to safeguard against their use. Very importantly, Madam President, we have recognized the need to work together to provide assistance to victims and committed to cooperate in that regard. Not least, we've also provided a good basis to continue this important process among states parties and other interested stakeholders. With all this, we have also achieved the broadest possible support for our treaty. And let me state clearly here also that we regret that it was not possible to have consensus on this text. Madam President, in this time of rising geopolitical risks and tensions, tremendous amounts of money, research, and human resources are spent on nuclear weapons programs, including for modernizing and upgrading arsenals. Our message today is clear. A large majority of states fundamentally disagrees with this course of action. Nuclear weapons continue to be an existential risk to humanity and need to be abolished. Our treaty is a crucial contribution to that end, while we remain fully committed to the other elements of our nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, in particular the NPT and the CTBT, to which our treaty will be complementary and a political reinforcement. Liechtenstein is convinced of the potential of our treaty to help free the world of nuclear weapons. Today will be remembered as a significant milestone to achieve this aim. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Le agradezco la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Liechtenstein, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Egypt, followed by Switzerland and Sweden.
Madam President, it is with great honor that I take the floor at this truly historic moment to express my delegation's sincere gratification with the adoption of a new international treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. As we witness history unfold today, we are proud to be among the community of nations that have supported the adoption of this landmark instrument. We congratulate you, Madam President, for your able leadership and commend you and your team for all the hard work in steering this conference to success. Success that will certainly remain memorable and acclaimed for decades to come. As we gather here today, on the 7th of July, 2017, the curtains fall to announce the closure of this extraordinary gathering. A gathering which brought together representatives of governments, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, academics, and even surviving victims of nuclear weapons, united by the common objective of delegitimizing and prohibiting nuclear weapons with a view to achieving a more peaceful and secure world for future generations. As we reach our final destination in this conference, we leave behind us a significant contribution to the body of law prohibiting an entire category of weapons of mass destruction. Those countries that have participated arduously in the deliberations and who have supported the adoption of this treaty can leave this conference feeling proud of this achievement. Madam President, Egypt's staunch support for nuclear disarmament is unwavering. For decades, my country has taken diplomatic strides in numerous forums to advance global calls to eliminate nuclear weapons with a view to ensuring a more peaceful and secure world. In spite of the unfortunate volatile nature of our region, and notwithstanding the well-known dynamics associated with our neighborhood, my country has nevertheless consistently championed collective security over selective security. Our deeply embedded belief in multilateralism stems from an ethical and principled conception that global challenges necessitates global partnership, and making the world a safer place requires collectivism rather than detachment, compromise rather than dissent, and leadership rather than inaction. Egypt, therefore, joins the community of nations today that wants a world free of nuclear weapons, a world guided by peace, not fear, a world safe through partnership, not division, a world driven by cooperation, not selectivity. And while we strive to promote this principled worldview, many nations may actively and oftentimes rigorously pursue national interests, a practice rather common in international relations. But in the midst of pursuing national interests, we nevertheless never lose sight of the overall collective global interest that transcends us all. Although we may occasionally differ in our perspectives on some elements, it is imperative that we place shared and mutual objectives at the heart of our endeavors. While some states are willing to surpass narrow imperatives for the sake of the global public good, it is unfortunate that several other states continue to prioritize their own interests at the expense of advancing collective and inclusive security for all. Madam President, our historic success could not have been achieved without the constructive and arduous engagement by civil society. My delegation would like to take this opportunity to express appreciation for the significant role played by civil society throughout the process of our negotiations. Although members of civil society are traditionally seated at the back of our hall rooms and procedurally given the opportunity to speak after our deliberations, their passionate devotion to the cause of abolition of nuclear weapons places them nonetheless at the forefront of respect for their collective spirit and outreach. We take this opportunity to commend the efforts by civil society. Madam President, we hope that today's landmark achievement will be inscribed as a historic significant step in the pursuit of realizing a world free of nuclear weapons. We take pride that our country, Egypt, took part in this endeavor and was among the community of nations that supported the adoption of this treaty. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Egypt, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Switzerland, followed by Sweden.
Madam President, first and foremost, I'd like to thank you and your team for your efforts throughout the negotiation process and for having guided us to the successful conclusion of our work. You accepted to assume what is undoubtedly a difficult task, and we are grateful for it. My thanks extend obviously also to the different facilitators and the Secretariat. Madam President, Switzerland voted yes on the adoption of the Prohibition Treaty because we share the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. We see the pressing necessity to take steps in this direction, an imperative that has been reinforced by the process on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons that unfolded over the past few years. Switzerland has taken the decision to take part in this negotiating conference, convinced that the Nuclear Prohibition Treaty can contribute to reaching the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. It has sought to contribute to negotiations in order to achieve a treaty that is effective and has the potential to gain universal adherence over time. A central element that has guided our participation in the negotiating process is the fact that the Prohibition Treaty should complement and reinforce existing norms and treaties forming the international nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime and in no way undermine it. This condition is essential for the Prohibition Treaty to effectively meet its objective and is an integral part of the mandate adopted by the UN General Assembly. While we supported the adoption of the Nuclear Prohibition Treaty in principle, we believe that the text should have been more affirmative with regard to our commitment to the NPT as the cornerstone of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. We have substantial concerns in particular regarding the three following aspects. First, the treaty is deficient in the sense that some of its provisions are not effectively verifiable. This constitutes a departure from the principle that we all have agreed to in the NPT framework that nuclear disarmament should be both irreversible and verifiable. Secondly, some of its provisions bear risks for existing norms, instruments, and fora. For instance, the generic reference to nuclear testing could undermine the CTBT norm, as well as efforts for its early entry into force. Provisions related to the IAEA safeguards might erode efforts to strengthen standards in this domain. Besides, tasks given to the meeting of states parties could duplicate or even contradict efforts undertaken in other fora. Finally, treaty provisions could also challenge the centrality of the NPT at it being the cornerstone of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. Thirdly, we regret that it hasn't been possible to have a more inclusive negotiation process. Key concerns of states who had question marks about the negotiating process, whether they finally took part in it or not, were for the most part, not taken into account. In addition, a number of treaty provisions lack clarity, may give rise to different legal interpretations, and therefore create some confusion and uncertainties. These elements combined are likely to have an impact on the effectiveness of the treaty, as well as on efforts towards its universalization. Madam President, in sum, Switzerland is committed to the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons, but also sees risk that this treaty may weaken existing norms and agreements and create parallel processes and structures which may further contribute to polarization rather than reduce it. It will thus be incumbent on the states parties to ensure, as they implement the Prohibition Treaty, that these risks are fully taken into account and adequately addressed. The states parties will have the responsibility to respect the mandate adopted by the UN General Assembly, according to which the Prohibition Treaty should complement and strengthen the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. For its part, Switzerland will make a careful assessment of the Prohibition Treaty to fully comprehend the impact and consequences of its provisions. It will follow closely the manner in which the treaty is interpreted and implemented, as well as assess if it effectively complements and strengthens the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Le agradezco la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Switzerland, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Sweden, followed by the Netherlands.
Madam President, in connection with today's adoption of a treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons by the conference, I would like to make the following explanation of vote. Motivated by a humanitarian perspective, mindful of the urgent need to break the stalemate, and willing to explore any path with potential of delivering concrete results, Sweden decided to support and participate in these negotiations. Anything else, we felt, would be to evade an obligation also enshrined in Article 6 of the NPT. We joined a broad majority of the UN memberships whose frustration with the lack of progress triggered this clear political stance against an increasingly dangerous status quo. The result of this effort is now before us in the form of a treaty. It does not meet all the expectations we had, but despite the complexity of the matter and the unprecedentedly limited time at our disposal, Sweden has voted in favor of the adoption of this treaty. One significant achievement of this treaty is the reaffirmation of the fundamental importance of the humanitarian perspective with regards to nuclear weapons. It is beyond doubt that any use of nuclear weapons would be catastrophic to humanity as well as to the environment. We warmly welcome the fact that at last we have a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, the only weapon of mass destruction not prohibited until now. Though nuclear weapons are not likely to disappear soon, we are convinced that the norm against the use and possession of nuclear weapons will be strengthened by this treaty. At the same time, we recognize that there are crucial elements of this treaty that do not meet what my delegation was aiming for. The NPT remains the cornerstone for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. We wanted this to be clearly articulated in the treaty. We have felt, however, that this view has not been shared by all delegations in spite of declarations made in the first committee and during the first session of the conference. Sweden does not subscribe to the language in preamble paragraph 10, which aims at describing international law as it stands today. Sweden maintains the view taken by the International Court of Justice in the Nuclear Weapons Advisory Opinion of 1996, namely that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, and in particular the principles and rules of humanitarian law. Sweden also notes the reference in PP9 to the prohibition on the use of weapons of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering reflects the general obligations on the parties to an armed conflict in their choice of means of warfare. It does not identify which weapons that fall under this prohibition. It should also be underlined that this prohibition should not be mixed up with the principle of distinction, which aims at protecting civilians. With respect to PP12, Sweden would like to underline that the obligation imposed by the Charter of the United Nations with respect to the obligations to refrain from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state are firmly established in the Charter and remain fully applicable irrespective of matters related to diversion for armaments. We had a strong preference not to have nuclear testing in this treaty, since we have the CTBT, which has established a norm respected by all countries but one. Regarding the scope of the application, we would have preferred clearer references in Article 1F specifying that it is direct assistance to third parties in prohibited activities which are covered and of relevance for this treaty. On verification, we are of course disappointed that it was not possible to have the additional protocol in CIRC 540 as the standard of verification for this treaty. We believe that that would have strengthened the credibility of the treaty and allowed for sufficient verifications of state parties' compliance with key elements of the general obligations. We are not in full agreement with respect to the chapeau to Article 8, meetings of state parties to this treaty, that meetings of state parties to this treaty are the most effective forum to discuss further measures on disarmament. As for Article 17, Sweden takes the position that the prerogative of interpreting what is to be considered the supreme interests of its national sovereignty rests with the sovereign state. We are not in full agreement with the language on Article 18. We had a strong preference to delete the words after the last comma. The NPT and the CTBT remains fully applicable even after this treaty enters into force. Nothing in this treaty can be interpreted as reducing the obligations of state parties to the NPT and the CTBT. Madam President, as the negotiations come to a close, another phase, not prejudged by today's decision, beckons: national digestion, debate, and decision. For Sweden's part, and I assume for many others, the treaty and its relation to civilian nuclear industry, trade, research, including nuclear defense research for people purposes, as well as broader security and defense policy interests, will be subject to the consideration by the government. Any decision to ratify and accede to the treaty will subsequently need to be taken by the Swedish Parliament. Madam President, lastly, I would like to thank all delegations and civil society organizations for active and friendly participation, the Secretariat and members of the Bureau for hard work. But most of all, a thank to you, Madam President, for guiding us to a successful conclusion of this important negotiation. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la distinguida delegación.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Sweden, and I now give the floor to the delegation of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me start by thanking you for all the efforts by yourself and your team over these past 3 weeks. We all know that yours was not an easy task, and all of us need to think about how to proceed after these weeks. While we cannot support this treaty, we appreciate how it has placed nuclear disarmament in the limelight and created a broad momentum for disarmament. While we would have liked to see more ambition reflected in its provisions, the treaty teaches us the valuable lesson that non-nuclear weapon states have their own responsibilities and should not hesitate to take them. We would also like to express our appreciation for the NGO community present here and the valuable work that they have done. The Netherlands aims to take these lessons to heart in moving forward from here. First, that means bridging the divide between supporters and detractors of this treaty. Broad support for this treaty, including by nuclear weapon possessors, is still far away. But we should not wait with seeking the middle ground, starting at the upcoming First Committee. We plan to take that chance to explore how we can restore a shared sense of purpose to the disarmament and non-proliferation regime. Second, we must not let our attention wither away. The draft before us rightfully recognizes the importance of education in this context. And the Netherlands will look into new ways to support education and research into innovative solutions. And we will also maintain focus on the risks associated with nuclear weapons and possible ways of mitigating these. In that context, one could think of security assurances, de-alerting, the role of nuclear weapons in military doctrines, and other forms of risk reduction. Third, we will continue to work towards the strengthening and the implementation of the NPT in any way we can. And this, of course, includes the elaboration of effective disarmament measures under Article 6. In this context, for example, we will continue our efforts in support of the other disarmament-related initiatives, such as the FMCT and disarmament verification. But we will also keep looking with our partners for other ways to further the implementation of the NPT. We will also keep striving towards increasing the transparency and inclusivity of its review process, building on the valuable experience we have gained as chair of the 2017 PrepCom and the regional conferences we have organized leading up to it. Madam Chair, notwithstanding these positive aspects of the ban treaty movement, the Netherlands could not support the draft that was put before us. We have signaled at the beginning of this session that we would be unable to sign up to any instrument that is incompatible with our NATO obligations, that contains inadequate verification provisions, or that undermines the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have negotiated in good faith and have been open about our intentions. Now we must be equally straightforward and conclude that this draft does not meet our criteria. The obligations in Article 1 are incompatible with our commitments as a NATO state. We attempted to rhyme these facts with the spirit of the treaty by introducing a temporality clause, but most delegations here could not reconcile with their views on a nuclear weapons ban. Furthermore, the draft is, in essence, not verifiable, and this harms its credibility. And of course, nuclear disarmament verification is something that we have just started to develop. The draft, however, fails to incorporate that notion by leaving sufficient flexibility for future developments or by encouraging its members to participate in verification-related initiatives. Moreover, the draft contains a safeguard standard that even in this day is not sufficient for the IAEA to draw a conclusion about the absence of undeclared nuclear activities. It will certainly not provide the kind of assurances needed towards a nuclear-free world. Like many others here, we have argued that this treaty should strengthen and complement the NPT as reflected by Resolution 71-258, and this text does not do that. Instead, it places the treaty above the NPT and sets up a comprehensive parallel review mechanism to which it assigns a mandate that at least partially overlaps with that of the NPT. This is a recipe for competition and fragmentation when our efforts on disarmament should be concentrated. Let us not forget, the NPT contains the only disarmament obligations binding the P5. Whatever its shortcomings may be, this makes it our primary framework for pursuing a world without nuclear weapons. Madam Chair, I started by pointing out how we can build on this process here to further advance the cause of nuclear disarmament, and we still have a lot of work ahead of us. We have heard many times that this treaty is not aiming to weaken existing instruments, but to encourage their further implementation. All of us who support nuclear disarmament must ensure that and refocus our efforts so that we can look forward towards further progress. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegation of the Netherlands, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Nigeria, followed by Austria.
Madam President, on behalf of the delegation of Nigeria, I would like to thank you immensely for the leadership you have provided as president of this landmark conference to prohibit nuclear weapons. Let me also seize the opportunity to commend members of the Bureau and the civil society organizations for their dedication and hard work throughout these negotiations. The adoption of this treaty today is indeed historic. It signposts a new beginning for states to be sufficiently guided by international law and to set forth the norm and standard for both nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states. This treaty is designed to reduce the likelihood of humankind ever again witnessing or experiencing the catastrophic disaster associated with the detonation of nuclear weapons on human settlements or the environment. Madam President, states, both big and small, must be united in reminding one another of the overarching need to protect the ecosystem and to demonstrate due diligence and consideration for others. As a co-sponsor of the UN draft resolution taking forward multilateral disarmament negotiations, being the precursor of this conference, let me assure all states of Nigeria's abiding faith and unrelenting commitment to continue to work towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Our country, Nigeria, and indeed the entire continent of Africa, shall remain a nuclear-free zone. We owe this to ourselves and to generations yet unborn. For too long, mankind has been living on the precipice. This must not be allowed to continue. As we depart from this conference, let us all be reminded of the noble reason that led to this gathering. The other leg of our work will begin shortly after the entry into force of this treaty. We must strive to bring in others, particularly the nuclear weapon states, to embrace this new beginning, even as we look brightly and with determination into the future. With hope, I thank you all.
Le agradezco la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Nigeria, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Austria.
The ship skillfully into the harbor. Your stewardship has been vital in achieving our common aim, the adoption of a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Our gratitude and admiration goes to you personally, but also to your whole team. Austria has, of course, voted in favor, since we wanted to establish the legally binding norm that has been missing with regard to the prohibition of weapons of mass destruction, the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. After more than 20 years of standstill in multilateral nuclear disarmament, there is finally an outcome. We have removed the last doubts whether nuclear weapons are legal and legitimate. This treaty lays the foundation for further progress in multilateral nuclear disarmament. As in the case of biological and chemical weapons, the legal prohibition comes first, and then the elimination of the weapons has to follow. We have taken great care that our new treaty complements the existing disarmament architecture, and in particular strengthens the NPT. And we have achieved that. We, the clear majority of the international community, have been motivated by the knowledge of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons use and the unacceptable risk that those weapons pose. I want to thank all delegations for their commitment and willingness to overcome many hurdles and send a strong common message. Nuclear weapons are illegal and should be eliminated. Our treaty contains a pathway with concrete measures towards our shared objective. We call on those countries that still rely on nuclear weapons in their security policy to join us for their own security and the security of all humanity. We will reach out and encourage them to join this landmark treaty with the objective of making it universal. The adoption of this treaty is just the beginning. The next stage will be the signature by many of our heads of state, prime ministers or foreign ministers starting on the 20th of September. We pledge to work hard for an early ratification, which should allow for an entry into force of our treaty within a short amount of time. Austria proposes to hold the first meeting of states parties in Vienna at the United Nations premises there. This would be a fitting venue in view of the presence of international organizations directly relevant to our treaty. Austria is proud of having served the international community in helping to bring about the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and wants to thank all our partners among states, international organizations, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and last but not least, civil society. Without the leadership so ably displayed by ICANN, we would not have achieved our goal today. Finally, let me thank the Hibakushas for their testimony, which has been a source of inspiration for us. Instead of repeating the horrors of the past, let us make this planet a safer place without nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Austria for his statement. And now we're almost close to the end of the morning session. And the interpreters have given us another 5 minutes. And so I would like to now give the floor to the delegation of Singapore. When we come back at 3 o'clock this afternoon, we're going to conclude with the list of speakers. We have 10 delegations who have requested the floor. After that segment, we're going to move on to the next segments of general statements. We'll listen to the High Representative, we'll listen to representatives of civil society, and then we will eventually close the meeting. And now I give the floor to the delegation of Singapore.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation would like to express its appreciation for your efforts, Madam President, as well as those... My delegation would like to express its appreciation for your efforts, Madam President, as well as those of your team in stewarding this conference towards its conclusions. Negotiations have been difficult due to the absence of many member states, the diverse positions and proposals expressed, and the time constraints. Nevertheless, we would like to thank the Secretariat for its unstinting support through the negotiations. Singapore has a long-standing and consistent position and remain committed, fully committed to the ultimate goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. We believe that we have a responsibility to our future generations and will continue to support efforts to make concrete and meaningful progress. Like other participants, Singapore participated in these negotiations in good faith and in a constructive spirit. We believe that this treaty could be a step towards our shared goal. We attempted to contribute to the discussions by tabling several proposals, including the addition of language based on Article 7 of the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty, as well as the deletion of an ambiguous phrase in Article 18 of this treaty relating to the relationship between this new treaty and other established disarmament treaties. Unfortunately, these proposals were not included in the final text. Singapore continues to be of the view that the treaty should not in any way affect the rights and obligations of state parties under other agreements, such as the treaties establishing the nuclear weapon-free zones, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. The NPT and UNCLOS in particular are integral pillars of and underpin the global architecture of international law. In addition, more effort should have been exercised in the framing of language in this treaty of vital importance in order to avoid inadvertently causing unnecessary legal uncertainty. We understand that efforts were made to reconcile the divergent views and place on record our appreciation for the work of the facilitators. While recognizing the inherent negotiating constraints, we are of the view that it would have been beneficial for more time to have been allocated for negotiations. This would have facilitated more in-depth discussion to breach seemingly contradictory positions and more time for proper internal consultations to incorporate the legitimate concerns of all domestic agencies, leading to a more robust and broadly acceptable treaty. For the above-mentioned reasons, it is with great regret that we have found ourselves constrained to abstain from voting on the finalization of this treaty. Our voting position does not detract from our commitment to disarmament and pursuing a world free of nuclear weapons. We will be carefully studying the provisions of the treaty and its broader implications in the context of our disarmament obligations. We request that our reservations be placed on record. Once again, Madam President, I want to thank you for leading this conference to a successful outcome. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Singapore. On the list of speakers for the beginning of this afternoon's meeting, I have Guatemala, Marshall Islands, Philippines, Thailand, Algeria, Panama, Trinidad and Tobago, Ireland, and Bolivia. So I would like to wish you a good lunch and exercising your right to food, and we will see each other at 3 p.m. this afternoon.
Congratulations. Let's celebrate.